Welcome to the Church Podcast, talking all things ministry so you can do church better. I'm your host, Christopher Wesley, and here with another great episode. On today's episode, we sit down with Charlotte McCorquodale. She is a researcher and one of the founders of the Ministry Training Source, organization that provides training and research for those in lay ecclesial ministry. Specifically, she has her roots in youth and young adult ministry, but Charlotte is starting to do research and training throughout all parish ministries, and it's so needed. And what I love about this conversation is we break down one of the her newest studies that are research findings that came out, and so we jump into a little bit of the research there. And so if you're a youth minister, if you are a pastor with a youth minister, or wanting to learn more about how to support pastoral leaders who work with youth and young people, you don't want to miss this episode. And actually, for all of our listeners, if you subscribe to our premium Church Podcast Plus subscription, you automatically support the research and the work that Charlotte is doing. And so all you got to do is sign up for the Church Podcast Plus. You can do that at thechurchpodcast.org. But enough of this little ad. We'll have more, during the show. But anyway, without further ado, here's Charlotte.
Okay.
All right, Charlotte, welcome to the Church Podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
Doing so good. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you.
Well, Charlotte, oh my gosh, it's going to be so much fun. And Charlotte, I'm ready to geek out on some research with you. But I'll try to keep up. You're definitely the expert in this field. But even though you and I have had a chance to collaborate and talk about things over the last couple of years and everything, do us a favor, and for our viewers and listeners who don't know who you are, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit of your journey of how you came to the Ministry Training Source?
Sure. I'm from Louisiana originally, born and raised Lake Charles, Louisiana. Right now, I reside in Metairie, which is right outside of New Orleans, but I also spend a lot of time in Lake Charles as well. I've been in ministry my whole life. I was planning on going to be a journalist, and I got involved in CYO at the very end of my senior year in high school. I literally got a call from a youth minister that said, "Will you come help me do a newsletter for our CYO?" And that's all it was, literally a call out of my senior English class, and here I am today. So that led me down a path of youth ministry. Lay ecclesial ministry and youth ministry just became a passion of mine. Started in parish ministry, moved into diocesan ministry, got a master's degree, and it was around 2000, right around 2000, I started work on my doctorate at LSU. Go Tigers. And I was taking a class. I'd worked in the Archdiocese. It was a long journey, parishes, diocese. I've worked in the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, in 2 parishes there, part-time with the diocese, full-time in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, which was an amazing experience for a couple of years as a consultant there with their archdiocesan staff, and then Archdiocese of Mobile director for 5 years. And then back in the Diocese of Lake Charles. And in that journey of training and that sort of thing, I had decided to go back to LSU to work on basically a doctorate in adult education. It's a fancy name, but human resource education and workforce development. But I was taking a class in adult education, basically. And one of the papers I was reading was on computer-based education. And that's really what began to stimulate my back. Now, this was in the late 90s. Okay, so the internet, baby, right? Baby internet. I mean, there's nothing that ever looked like what we've got today. No. Okay, so people have to understand quite how old I am and quite how young everything else that was digital was. And so just to get that sense, but that's what sparked my mind to say, you know what, I think there's a solution here for ministry leader training, because it just was so hard to get people to come to training, especially in Mobile.
Mm.
So that's a long answer to say that's what sparked it. There was a conversation between myself, Lee Sturton, who was the co-founder of Ministry Training Source, and Anna Scally in a car talking about that article and about the need for this and how do we help the church move into the digital age. And so in 2000, we founded this organization that turned 24 in May this
Wow.
year, and next year it'll be 25. So, and at first we were a provider, and now we're mostly consultants. And I do a lot of research because, as a Research One university, that's really one of the things that the PhD granted me. And my dissertation ended up being on, because of the workforce development part of it, on my role as, a youth minister. And the evolution of this role of a lay ecclesial minister in the church. And that
Yeah.
helped.
No, and that's awesome. And I mean, I think it's such a gift. And going back to accessing the internet, like you said, and you said helping the church get into the digital age. I feel like we're still and always helping the church get into the digital age because it keeps on changing. And I have to applaud you because you're looking at the internet back in the '90s, right? And like you said, it's nothing to what it is today, and we couldn't even imagine at that time what it would be today. But now we're like addressing the same thing with things like artificial intelligence and all these different things, and it's kind of like, okay, what's the church's role in that? So there's a lot of courage that has to be going into that, and thank goodness you took that step, because I think what you guys provide with ministry training source has been an inspiration to me with Marathon, but also has helped us gain clarity around these things that we love doing as as men and women who want to dedicate our lives to serving alongside the clergy in our parishes and dioceses. Again, one of the reasons I'm excited about this conversation is because recently you just came out with a study of pastoral leaders serving young Catholics, examining network vulnerability amidst a web of ministries. And so, long title, but lots of great information in there. Tell us a little bit about what spawned this specific study, and some of your hopes to gain from that. And of course, we're going to, in this conversation, dive a little bit further into that. But yeah, what was the thought process behind having this specific study?
So, like I said, in 2000, 2001, when I did my original dissertation research, I often joked about the fact that I wrote that I wrote a book to prove to my dad that I had a real job. Explained my whole life as that's a real job. And I wanted to title it Drawing a Circle Around Lay Ecclesial Ministry. Dr. Zeni Fox, a real leader talk about a leader way back in youth ministry in the 70s and 80s with John Roberto, Brian Reynolds, great researcher for the field. She was a person that worked with me, and we were talking about the church bishops hesitant to say who's in and out of the circle of lay ministry. But when I brought that to my advisors, they said, Chris, they said, no, dissertation title's got to be, long. So, that's why it had this long tentative title about, the emergence of lay ecclesial youth ministry in the Roman Catholic Church in the United States. Because, it's got to be next to a biology dissertation title, right? So that's why my research titles are so long, P.S., by the way. But this research is actually an extension of that. So right now, I just launched this week this continuation of this longitudinal study. So it's going to be 25 years in the making. But in 2016, we've done 3 data collection points, but in 2016, we did another survey. And that's when I began to realize we're dealing with a whole different realm of youth ministry leaders. And so before we started this study that we launched this week, I felt like we had to go back and listen. And so that's how we got to the study you're referencing to. We went and did a study where we listened to 127 ministry leaders who are serving the young church, from youth to young adults, and mostly focused, I'll be honest, on young people. We really tried to access the young adult community, and we really did by the youth and young adult ministry leader part. And we called it a network because we didn't just look at the people who had the title of youth minister, director of youth ministry coordinator. We said, who are all these people? And so that's who we listened to.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And so you recognize this need. You started to listen to 120 plus, men and women in this field. And so what were some of the initial things that started to stick out? What were some of the things that you saw that really grabbed your attention? And maybe it was an affirmation of something you already knew, but you needed that affirmation, or maybe it was something completely like new.
We had a hunch that some things would be kind of bleak post-COVID. So we had a hunch that some things would exist. I don't know if I thought it would be quite as bad as it was, as we found it to be. One of my favorite quotes from the report is that pastoral leaders of youth and young adult ministries are a conundrum of joy-filled ministers serving at times in a bleak post-COVID mission field. We just kind of kept hearing again and again them describing the church as dying, and the struggles they were having, and trying to get young people to come, trying to just get anything kind of, and the challenges that young people were facing in terms of their mental health and etc. So there was just a lot that you could tell that there was a lot of burden on them. And yet when you'd ask them to talk about what brings them joy in ministry or etc., they would just light up. And the way they talked about what gives them life in their ministry, you could tell that they're joy filled and they're committed. And so it was conundrum.
And it's interesting. So it sounded like at first, everything's bleak, but once you started to hear the stories of the relationships they had with young people, like it's reminded of that joy. And it is interesting because I see that a lot with my clients as well, right? Like you're talking to them and they're just like, no one wants to come back to church. No, like I feel like I'm lost. I don't know why I'm doing this and things like that. And then once you start to say, well, what are some of the highlights? What are some of the bright spots? It's almost kind of like all of that just disappears. But I feel like as a community of lay ecclesial ministers, that's one of our challenges, right? Is to I think there's just been a lot of hurt, a lot of battles, whether it's with COVID or with scandals or with just numbers declining, and it's hard to feel good. But I guess I'm curious, based on the research or just even with your experience, what are some of the big challenges that you're seeing pastoral leaders face today, especially those working with youth and young adults?
They have to, over and over again, they said they have to justify their role. That there's a real expectations gap that's going on. People don't understand what their role is. And, that's something that has been clear from the beginning of ministry, I think, with lay ecclesial ministers, lay ministers from the 80s on. But it's a continuing issue. And so this whole justification of my job, though, I think is rising. The multifaceted roles that they have, the multi-audiences, that's an issue. And then fear for their job for some of them.
Yeah.
And the struggles many of them are facing in terms of as they think about the future. I mean, I think, are they going to be able to raise a family on this salary, etc.? Many of them are looking at those kind of issues. And then I'll say the final one is pastors. The biggest thing we found was pastors, the linchpin. Now, I know that that's not that kind of a big aha moment. Of course they are, Chris, everybody knows that, right?
Right.
You've been around it all.
Right.
But we know it. But what do we do with it? And how do we help people? And, your folks that you just talked about, your clients are lucky because they're getting support. But, many of the people I talked with, now you have to remember, I was doing this from a research perspective. I also have a heart of a pastoral minister. And so it was pretty difficult keeping it in a research tone to know that some of these people are hurting terrible. It was difficult after getting off of these research interviews and just having to take a deep breath because, I couldn't necessarily just go in there and comfort them. I wanted to sit there and fix it for them and give advice. And, you can't do that because you have to keep it, and I had to. And so it's a challenge because you can see they don't, I had one young lady, she pretty much cried the entire hour we talked.
Yeah.
It was heartbreaking, it really was. And so just to know that reality is that while what you just said is really true, your clients have the benefit of having some support directly. One of the things we found is that the only way a lot of these ministry leaders get support is if they create it themselves. When I was growing up in ministry in the 80s and in the 90s, either I was given support by my diocese or I was in a diocese creating support for other people. I mean, it didn't seem like we were doing it ourselves that much. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I didn't feel like I had to do it myself that much.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because I think part of it is there's somewhere along the line where we're not we're afraid to legitimize what we do as an actual profession in a way, and therefore then advocate for some of these things that other lines of work do provide, like professional development, certification, fair paid salaries, accountability, things like that, which they do. There are, and this is not to paint we're not painting every church in this way, but it's just based on your research, some of the things you're finding. And it's interesting, going back to the first point you made of justifying the role job expectations gap, because one of the, to say it cracked me up, but the kind of caught my attention and made me chuckle, because it's how many times have we heard this? Is one of the quotes you captured was, well, when you asked the question, how'd you get into ministry? And one person said, well, apparently they needed a new youth minister back then. So he was like, I'm assuming the priest, I need a new youth minister. Do you want the job? And I'm like, how do you say no to a priest? Right. But I said, I'll do my best. And, it's like having a 14-year-old and mentoring teenagers throughout the years as a youth minister and everything like that. You hear about them saying I want to do this as a career. I want to do that as a career. And once in a while you get the person who's I want to do what you do, Mr. Chris, or I want to be a youth minister or work in the church. But it felt like, from reading some of the research and, even through the clients, that a lot of people find themselves in ministry, but don't necessarily pursue that career or vocation of ministry in the same way they might with the priesthood or, any other career out there. And I don't know if that's fair to say, but it kind of looked like some of the quotes that you captured. It was yeah, I didn't know what else I was going to do with my life. And a priest asked me, a therapist asked me, I just got involved. And I don't know. And I think that doesn't help in the fact that we're trying to figure out what this job actually is.
I think you're capturing a fair amount that is true. And especially, I would say, in small towns. Because, they just don't have that many options. That's one of the things we really discovered, and I continue to discover. And even some of the research I'm doing lately with pastors, I've been having a chance now to do some listening with pastors. That was one of the things we recommended, and then have found now some funding with NFCYM and the Accompaniment Project, which I'm really excited to do some writing on. But they just don't have as many choices. Right. And so they kind of have to take what they can get. And so you kind of hear and see that more, right? But the opposite, though, I think is true. One of the other places you see the most ministry leaders, you get the most ministry leaders from, is from other ministry, from ministry itself. So, people like myself, I was a product of ministry.
Yeah.
I became a ministry leader because of my ministry leader, because I wanted to be like her, so I wanted, she was my mentor, and that's what I wanted. I was inspired by her ministry. So, and that's what we found back in 2000, and it's been consistently true. So, and that's one of my concerns, to be honest with you, Chris, because I worry with the decline of ministry itself to young people, we will have a decline of ministry. And with the decline of youth ministry and the decline of youth ministry leaders coming from youth ministry, we will have the decline of ministry leaders in general, because years ago, in the first few studies I did, when I asked people why are they leaving ministry, youth ministry, they would say to do another form of ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And now people are saying, because they're leaving because they have, it's not making enough money. I mean, to leave because, they're leaving for retirement, or because to get another job because they need to make more money or to have a family. And so that's bad for the church. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it seemed like, people, there is a beauty of like ministry begets ministry, right? Like young people, because it's almost like this built-in apprenticeship, right? You come to youth ministry, you're gonna experience it. You're gonna see your leader in action. He or she's gonna include you in all that stuff, especially with peer leadership. And then there's this like weird little gap, of like formal education and formation that could happen in the university setting. And there are universities that do offer these tracks, but the practicality of them or the success of them, there's too few, I think, to really measure that. But then it's like you launch them into this world where it's kind of like it's almost like parishes then aren't ready to receive that person, or the jobs are far and few between, or there just aren't the right things in place. And I think for me, that's where it gets really overwhelmed. Hey, everyone. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about one of our sponsors. One of the questions that I get a lot is, what are some of the most important resources you could have in ministry? Well, number one is prayer, right? Prayer is essential. Can't overstate that. Second are volunteers. Without volunteers, you're stuck doing it alone. But if there was a third one, I'd have to say it's what you wear, your t-shirts, right? You don't have to be in youth ministry to wear really cool graphic Catholic t-shirts. You can be in any ministry, and thank God for organizations like Sacrilegious, where they not only supply you really cool t-shirts, but mugs, socks, things for babies, stickers, all sorts of cool things that will not only make you look awesome, but make you feel holier. And so we'd love to, again, send you to sacrilegious.com to check out all their awesome gear. Click on the show notes below and not only start feeling holier, but look holier too. It's the third most important resource according to this advertisement. All right, back to the show. Right, it's kind of like the chicken and egg. Like, where do we tackle this problem to help define what ministry leadership is, and even going back to some of the other points you had, like justifying, not just justifying role and expectations, but making sure the youth minister doesn't become the tech minister, the janitor, the children's minister, and so forth. So defining that, but also, educating our pastors on that as well, because, it's not that I've learned that it's not that pastors don't want to serve the youth. It's almost kind of like there's not clarity on how to support those efforts, if that's fair. But, now that you're having these conversations, what are some of the things that you're learning with talking to pastors about, like some of the research that you found in this study, and some of the things that you've seen in your experience?
Most of this is pretty preliminary, so I really can't speak to too much of it. But I will say that this whole concept of measuring success in ministry is a challenge for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And the dilemma between trying to quantify it with numbers, or trying to quantify it by in a way, to qualify it rather, by saying it's about faith growth and it's about these aha moments and seeing young people be transformed. And it's a spectrum somehow, if you want to put it somehow between these things that people are looking at to say, are one of these or both of these true, or is it seeing growth in people's attendance at church or young people's involvement? There's all kinds of things that I've heard described. And so, that being the case, getting people on the same page about that, having these conversations about that is absolutely critical, because no one's having these conversations. And when we started having them both with pastors and ministry leaders, but especially with ministry leaders, It was very tender, Chris. I don't know if you've had these conversations with them, but they feel very judged, because they are in the rooms when these kids are being transformed. So they know their ministry is real and meaningful. And then they're in these situations where people are saying, only 15 kids came. And yet they're looking at it going, man, but these 15 kids are in these heavy, deep, and real things going on. And I know it. And yet they're judged, and they're, again, justifying the job, all this stuff. And so they're feeling judged. So it's a tender conversation. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so getting people on the same page is really, really important in this issue.
Yeah, no, I think that is the hardest thing. It's and as a researcher, right, it's not just the quantitative but the qualitative data, right? That you like. I think we talk about numbers so often. It's like, what's the attendance look like? How many kids signed up? What's the giving look like? And we all know that to measure life change just in that aspect is too narrow and it's going to limit the whole scope of it. So I guess, like, as a researcher, what's advice that you can give to just the local youth minister to put together measurements or data to evaluate growth and change? I mean, like, especially if they're like, for someone who's never had experience in doing, official research, what are some things that, someone in a parish setting can do to maybe gather that data and share that with not just the pastor, but sometimes parish council or just parishioners in general?
All good research starts with listening. So needs assessment is a real important form of research. And so listening, and so I think that's the first part. And, you can do that through surveys, or you can do that by sitting down and listening. And so I think a lot of it has to do with, how much you know about the community and the people that you're with. A lot of people try to use just surveys and I feel like that's just the best way to do it. But I guess for me, and I don't know, it kind of has to go with an example from COVID, but I don't know if that's okay if I give it an example now about that. But, it has to do with the fact that lots of folks didn't know their people during COVID. And I think they tried to move to a technology solution when they didn't have relationships built. And so I guess for me, in terms of a research solution, is if you don't know your people, that's kind of why we went back to qualitative listening. I didn't feel like I had my hands and my pulse, and I don't feel like the church had their hands and pulse on who these leaders were. Right. So we had to go listen. Now that I feel like I have a better pulse, I can go do a survey. So I guess I would say, do it that way. If you feel like you have a pulse on it, then you can do a survey and maybe, get your needs and information that way. But if you don't have a good pulse on where people are in the kids or the parents, then the first thing you got to do is listen, one-on-one in focus groups, that sort of thing. And in terms of sharing, I think that's very important. And I think we need to get people on the same page. Is it important to share numbers? Sure, it's important to share numbers, but don't just share numbers. You share the things that we share. Go to our report. You see a really good example. Now, and it's not just me that wrote it. I had a lot of people help me identify good examples of quotes, but you see good examples of what it might look like to share quotes from young people confidentially. And that's a good way to share good news. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
And struggles, right? And struggles. Adults need to hear how young people are saying, this is really hard and going on in my life. Now, is that something that's going to be hard to do for your average person? Yeah. So maybe sometimes you need to bring other people to do that kind of stuff. Please don't pretend to be a researcher, just like you're not going to pretend to be a mental health person. Don't try to do that. So I'm not recommending that, but I'm just saying you can use the words of young people just like you can, just like we did in some ways. So.
Well, and we shouldn't have to be in that situation.
Stories of young
yes.
people, that's the way to say it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, capturing the stories is definitely, because there's so many ways that you can use those stories to recruit, to inspire people, things along those lines. But yeah, no, I think it's a shame that we even have to put ourselves in that situation where we're justifying our ministry, where, it is something that's so valuable to it. But and I mean, we could go off on a whole nother tangent about proper managing and goals and things like that would help a pastor or a supervisor with that person. And I think that's the hard thing, right? You shared this with me in our pre-notes, like measuring success is a touchy subject, right? Because, how people view success or health in their ministry, it's going to depend. But I think one of the most valuable things that you shared was the fact that we have to assess the needs, right? If you don't know the mission field that you're serving in, then you're never going to be able to really clarify that good success. And so you have to assess those needs and listen to others. And I think that is so huge. Through your research or in other conversations, what strategies have you found successful that ministries are doing? Like, what are some of the strategies that you have found effective that pastoral leaders have done to engage and impact and shepherd the community?
I think there were a couple of examples that I heard in the actual research that I really thought were just like, wow. Like I thought, those people were doing really cool things. And so I'll share a couple of them with you.
Yeah.
One guy did a weekly video podcast message to his team. It was really short, but he did pretty much all his kind of media. His team did that in this podcast, but it was really kind of a simple thing. I mean, I don't know how technical you are with what you're doing even here, but the way he described it, it wasn't like a really high tech, but he shared it with me about how he started it during COVID and the success it had. And I started realizing, everybody seems to be going outside to look for content to connect with their kids. And this guy realized that it's all about the relationship. He's talking to his kids constantly. And so in his podcast, he's talking to them about what he's talking to them about. And, he's integrating the weekly gospel message into that. And so that they can look forward to it at Mass. And so, but it small little 1.5 minute podcast. I mean, it's quick.
Right. But still effective. I mean, right.
Susie told me that this is going on this week in school and blah, blah. I mean, but I just thought, it's simple, brilliant. It's easy. It's visible. It's them. He connects it on whatever platforms they're on, and it's relation. I just thought, wow, okay. So if I was a youth minister at this time in my life in a parish, that is something that's how I would be using technology. Is that way? I wouldn't be buying videos from some company. I'd be doing that. So that's one of the things I thought was super cool.
No, definitely. Especially when you can create it out of your own context too. Like you said, it's personalized. I mean, I remember struggling with, video curriculum because in the parish that I work at, it's very multicultural, and the people who appeared on the video, they were very knowledgeable, engaging to a point, but it's like they didn't look like or share the stories that could relate to the teens that we were serving. And so that was one of the encouragements that we had to start creating some of our stuff in-house as well. And then, I think like kind of going back to what you were saying before, right? Like listening is one of the best strategies, and just communicating, like learning different ways to communicate like authentically and interpersonally with young people. It doesn't, and I'm curious as to your thoughts. I think we're kind of going away from the big stage, big room youth ministry, although there is a place for that. And that there is this little bit of thirst for, I don't want to say necessarily small groups, but intimacy in the relationships that we are developing with young people. Curious to your thoughts on that. Or
we're definitely seeing a pendulum swing.
yeah,
In the history of youth ministry, we've seen quite a number of big pendulum swings in terms of focus. And I think we are seeing a pendulum swing from the large programs. And we'll always have the big Steubenville conferences and CYCs. Those moments will always of encounter and gathering will always be part of ministry with young people now. There's no way they won't.
Yeah.
But will programs, some of those kind of things always exist in the parish, age specific? I'm not sure if those will exist at the level they did. It's just not going to be sustainable as it seems from a leadership standpoint. This shift, this pendulum that's happening, I think it is to this more of what we're going to look to see. Is it a model, accompaniment model? I'm not sure. But I do think it is the smaller group model where you're going to be seeing more and more adults accompanying young people in smaller groups. What will that look like? I think the accompaniment project that the NFCYM is doing is going to be exploring that. I think Good Faith that just got some additional willing funding that just did Next Level is exploring that exact model. I mean, so I think there are models that are beginning to come out that are looking at that exact type of thing. What does it look like to have small groups of young people doing small groups inside parishes with a couple of adults mentoring them? I think we're moving towards that. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Integrate them directly into the parishes. Good Faith does it through social justice service and having young people take leadership.
Hey, sorry. I know another ad. All right. Yep. We'll get back to the show. Trust me. But I wanted to take some time to talk about the church podcast premium subscription. That's right. We have a premium subscription where when you sign up for CP Plus, you not only get episodes earlier, you not only get away from these ads and these annoying ads and everything, but we're going to send you a free subscription to MYM Premium where you get videos and downloadable resources for you and your team so you can get better at ministry. You also will get producer credits, and there's nothing better than producer credits, right? Especially for a niche podcast like this one. So why wait for that? Also, when you sign up for CP Plus, we're going to give you 10% off your first custom t-shirt order at 4 Marks Printing, one of our sponsors here at the Church Podcast. But the best part, when you sign up for CP Plus, is that 50% of your proceeds, 50% of what you give towards CP Plus each month goes towards the Ministry Training Source, which is an organization that's focused on research for professional ministry. So even if you're not a professional minister, you're helping us figure out how we can support and build up the profession of lay ecclesial ministry. So what do you have to do? Just go to thechurchpodcast.org and scroll down and you'll see a box for the Church Podcast Plus premium subscription. And that's all you got to do. So instead of buying a third of a pizza, sign up for a monthly subscription at thechurchpodcast.org. Anyway, enough from me. Back to the show. So, yeah, it's definitely exciting to see things like small groups definitely emerge. Looking ahead, though, and you were kind of alluding to this, what do you see as the future direction for youth and young adult ministry? And what do you feel like, and maybe this is going back to the three things you talked about, what do you see as the necessary changes that we need to make to sustain these efforts?
Necessary changes? Well, I think really we have to do something to support pastoral ministry leaders and grow the field. Mm-hmm. I do think one of the pendulum shifts, unfortunately, has been away from formation, away from formalizing the field. You know, when I was doing this research early on, we had people with master's degrees. We had people who were looking for long-term commitments to this ministry. And now that's just not the case at all. It's actually absolutely opposite. Wow. And there's all kinds of reasons, I'm sure, for that. I can give you good reasons for it. One of the reasons is because the early generations of ministry leaders that were lay came out of early Vatican II were actually some of the religious men and women that left priesthood and religious life. So they already had reformed. And so they set a standard that folks like me that came right after them said, well, we got to get master's degrees because everybody did.
Right.
But now folks who have this aren't having the same support that other folks had to get master's degrees in the 80s and 90s. So it makes sense.
Yeah.
Millennials who came into pastoral and parish ministry just don't have that support. And so just like their counterparts don't have that support in every other profession that exists, right? And so these things are real. And I'm very worried that if we don't put structures in place, who will wake up to worry about youth and young adult ministry?
Yeah.
Because it's at the bottom of the list, Chris. So first thing, I think we have to start thinking about that. And I think that has to be collaborative. We can't just say, well, it's going to be each individual church's problem or issue or challenge. It's got to be a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
So I think it's got to be collaborative. And I'll give you what one pastor that I talked to said that he and his collaborative set of little rural churches are doing. They actually described, you remember the section of the report that talked about self-fulfilling, the whole self-fulfilling hiring, kind of circular self-fulfilling. So when we came up with that, Dr. Bob McCarty is the one that kind of named that description because we kept seeing that pattern repeat. And so he's the one that described it that way. And when he named it, we all were like, yeah, but it's been hard to kind of get it around, but it's this concept for the folks that are listening, that basically that people get hired at this low rate, and then they never get to the point where they stay long enough to make enough money. They leave, and so the rate continues to stay at a very, very low rate, and so it's just this self-fulfilling prophecy of circular hiring that they get stuck. And so these parishes never get through a really good long-term experience of hiring. Well, anyways, this pastor I'm interviewing starts describing this and telling me that he and these 4 other pastors had this exact experience, and he's describing it. And as I'm listening to it, I'm like, yay. Yeah. He's describing this exact thing. And I knew this existed because we heard it, but now pastors are describing it. So I was really excited. And he said, so this is what we're thinking about doing. He says, we've decided that we're going to pool our resources and we're going to hire one person and pay them really good to coordinate ministry for all 4 of our parishes, 5 parishes. And then we're going to hire other people that are going to be more transition, maybe in these young adult, more roles. But we're going to try to keep this one person to give us the sustainability. And I don't know. I think it has a model for the future. More and more places are going to this multi-parish role. I think it's a great idea. But I think the thing that makes what he is talking about that's great is the lower level of employees. Giving one person 5 parishes to do ministry is a little nuts.
Yeah, a little nuts.
I mean, it's a little nuts. It's a little nuts. So I want to make clear to say that. But one person with a few others underneath, even if those people are transitioning, I think that's okay. So that's one of my thoughts, and I thought it was pretty exciting.
Yeah, and it's good to hear that. It's good to hear that, like you said, that pastors are collaborating around that idea, that they're working around that that thought process, because I think that's so critical that we work together in this realm. And not to say that it's all about money, but like if someone has a challenging job, if they feel supported, and I don't just mean financially, but if they feel supported, if they're being trained, if they're being formed, then the task at hand doesn't seem so insurmountable, right? And I think that's part of the problem is we're not just talking about, hey, let's raise the salaries of these individuals, although that's needed. We're not just talking about making sure people get master's degrees in the proper formation, but it's all around support, and making sure that, I think one of the biggest traps that Satan tries to put us in is to make us feel isolated and alone. And I know I was talking to someone the other day who was worried about this transition happening in their parish, because with this one person leaving, their supervisor leaving, they were going to possibly be moved into their own department. and their own department of one. And they were like, now I'm going to be isolated and forced into my own work silo. And they were really nervous about that. And so I think like one of the biggest and best things we can do, right, is just figure out, how do we support the pastoral leader? How do we support them in all facets of formation, their resources, their pay, and of course just their journey for sure. Yeah.
Do they get a retreat? Do we pay them? Do we give them time? I mean, it's just essential that we give them time, especially, it's just so essential. So,
Amen.
And that we try to understand their role and their job, and that we also help them set some limits. I heard people telling me crazy things that they're texting with kids at midnight, and again, as the researcher, I'm wanting to go, don't do that. I mean, as the pastor minister, I'm wanting to go, don't do that.
Right.
Why are you doing that?
Right.
I'm just wanting to, but as a researcher, I'm taking notes. But I mean, I just, so there's some parts of me there, we just need help to set some limits and do some reasonable things. But then at the same time, of course, there's reasons why you do that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But, you could tell this was just a regular practice. It wasn't just like, because this kid's got a crisis. It was a regular practice. We're talking to kids on a regular practice at midnight.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, we also have to take ownership, those of us in lay ecclesial ministry. As easy as it might be to blame the pastors or the system, we got to set those boundaries and step up.
I'm working all the time. Well, okay, but
you can say no. Yeah.
Why are you working at midnight? I mean,
your phone turns off too. It's like.
Well, you're right. That's a little bit crazy to think. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, but then again, if people aren't getting any support, they don't have any models, they haven't been formed, and they're thinking they're being there for kids, and so. This is why formation is critical. Even the most basics, formation of ministry is so important. And not getting any formation at all and not having it be a priority is just a shame. And I can understand it, but it should be at least a minimal requirement. I'm glad that there's more and more things out there that are for people that are just starting ministry.
Definitely.
That really is needed so much.
Well, Charlotte, I feel like we could talk for hours about this because I love, again, just diving into it. But
sorry, we're gonna run on some stuff.
No. But we're one thing we do with all of our guests is we ask them these 5 final questions, and so sent them to you ahead of time. And want to know, are you ready to answer those questions?
Yeah.
All right, let's go for it. So, in addition to prayer, what is one tool or resource that has helped you be your most productive self?
Have you ever heard of Fireflies.ai?
Yeah, no, I've heard of it. I haven't explored into that. Yeah.
It's a transcription tool that you can add on to anything, or you can use for anything.
Yeah.
It's cheap. I use it with Zoom meetings. I use it for everything. I can upload anything. So I've been using voice memos a lot lately. And I can upload those and transcribe them. But I use it for anything I want to transcribe. And so it's awesome.
Yeah, I use Otter.
Not too expensive.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I use Otter AI with similar tool, sync it with Zoom and stuff like that. I have to explain to people who the note taker is sometimes on Zoom settings, but it's definitely helpful to have all those transcriptions right there for sure. All right, so question number 2, what are you currently reading or watching or listening to that you feel like everyone else has to experience? And it can be your own guilty pleasure. It can be totally pertaining to what you do, but what's the thing that you're loving most?
I'm really loving this lady, Britt Adrianta, Wired to. She has a whole series, Wired to Grow, Wired to Resist, and Wired to Connect. It's all about brain science. And this one's the one I like the most, the brain science to resist. It's a new model for creating change. But, for me, I just love the whole concept of how our brain works, especially for learning. I want to teach in a way that our brain works to learn most effectively. And so, and I want to help change happen in a way that it works for our brains. So anyways, I think she's really cool in the way she thinks.
That's awesome.
Wired 2.
Wire 2. I'll have to check that out because I also like to
Wired 2.
learn why we think the way we think and do the things that we do. Although hopefully it's not above my understanding pay grade over my head, but
No, she's a good writer. I mean, she does it the way your brain's wired to. So.
Awesome. All right, this third question, it's one of my favorite questions to ask, is what's the worst ministry or leadership advice that you've ever gotten from someone regarding the work that you do?
What's the worst ministry advice I ever got? Worst ministry advice I ever got was to not let my pastor win at golf. I had someone say, "Oh no, it's okay if you beat him," and I'm like, "No, I think I need to let him win." And they were like, "Oh no, he's good." And I was really lucky. I've been playing golf since I was 10, and and I had hit the first 2 holes, and I won them, and I could tell right away that was not good, and so I let him win.
After that, you just took a couple of extra strokes and a mulligan or 2, and just
right.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm not that good a golfer,
right?
But that's how bad he.
Oh man, okay. I think that's the best worst advice I've ever heard. So it's definitely a class.
This person was like, "Oh no, come on, man, you should beat him." I mean, it was another staff member. He can handle it. Well, they were trying. I guess they were trying to get me fired.
Yeah. So, in addition to telling people let your pastor win at golf, what if you had one message for a new ecclesial ministry leader starting out in the field? What would it be?
You got to breathe every day. You got to breathe every day. And breathe before you say anything. Take a deep breath. I think when I was young, I was so excited and I would just say things all the time immediately. I would never always listen. I would just speak. And sometimes it got me in so much trouble. And sometimes it made me end up doing so much more work than I needed to do because I would say, I'll do that.
Yeah.
And instead, if I would have just breathed and listened, I probably would have gotten out of I'm just saying, so I would say breathe. Breathe. Just before you say a word, breathe, listen, and then speak. Especially the extroverts out there.
Yeah.
Just breathe for a second.
I need that advice quite often, so I appreciate the reminder on that. And because we like to end things on a high note, what's your biggest hope for the church at this time?
All of the 127 pastoral leaders that I interviewed, they gave me such hope. Even the one that I spent a whole hour crying with, because one, they took time out of their life to do that, but just the hope, the love they had for the church, for the young. It reminded me of 1980 and 1981, why I got involved in this ministry and why I continue to do the research and the work that I do to help support it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And, I'm so appreciative of the work that you did and for those 127 people who did share their story, because, that it's not always easy to do, to talk about the hard stuff as well as even talk about the good stuff. Right. And I think there's so much that we can gather and learn. And we'll definitely have a link in the show notes to how people can access the report and even support you all at Ministry Training Source. But Charlotte, if people want to connect with you, what's the best way that they can do that?
I think just go to our website or go email me, charlotte@ministrytrainingsource.org, or go to the website, ministrytrainingsource.org. And also, we're doing our next study right now. So go to the website. You can participate in it. It's for all pastoral leaders who are leading ministry with youth and or young adults.
Awesome. Well, Charlotte, thanks again for being on the show. And
thank you,
we'll definitely have to have you back on to talk about some of the future research you're doing. So
love it.
Awesome.
It'd be great. Thanks. Take care.
All right. This has been a production of Marathon Youth Ministry, the church podcast talking all things ministry, produced by Stephen Herrera and Be Well Creative. Music provided by Loco Joseph. No animals were hurt in the production of this podcast. Please be sure to tip your waiters. See you next time.